December 21st, 1968, the countdown to one of the greatest moments in exploration began. The first manned lunar flight, Apollo 8, was scheduled to fly 230,000 miles out into space, orbit the moon 10 times, and return home. For the first time in history, humans were poised to head away from Earth and venture out to another world.
It took a lot of guts, it took a lot of nerve to do Apollo 8. It really was a gutsy mission. The biggest thing about Apollo 8 that I was impressed with was that the country let us do it. It showed the real capability of this country, the real willingness of this country to do things which were forward-reaching and took some nerve to do.
In 1962, when President John F. Kennedy committed the United States to sending men to the moon before the end of the decade, NASA was already struggling to catch up with its counterpart in the Soviet Union. Encouraged by Kremlin leaders to create high-profile missions, the Soviets had awed the world time and again with their achievements in space. The first satellite, the first man in orbit, the first long-duration flight, the first dual capsule flights, the first woman in space, the first spacewalk. In the eyes of the world, through the mid-1960s, the Soviets were the leaders in space exploration. With the Soviets pushing towards a lunar flight before the end of the year, NASA managers gambled on a daring move to put the Apollo program back on track. A risky mission to orbit the moon. Since 1961, when the Soviet Union flew the first manned flight, 34 Soviets and Americans had orbited the Earth, but no one had ever headed straight out. Tests of the massive Saturn V rocket system, including flights that were called Apollo 4, 5, and 6, were hampered by technical problems that sent the rocket team back to the drawing board again and again. And by early 1968, it was apparent that construction of the lunar landing module was also hopelessly behind schedule. Apollo manager George Low spent several months trying to come up with some way to get the program back on track. Low knew that something drastic had to be done to preserve any realistic chance that an American would land on the moon before the end of the decade.
Low very quietly reviewed the situation and came up with this brilliant idea to take the second Apollo flight and instead of sending it into Earth orbit with a lunar lander that wasn't going to be ready, send it to the moon without a lander. Just do the part that says we're going to go from the Earth to the moon, test out the communications, the navigation, all of those things that you're going to have to do anyway later on for a landing. You don't need the lunar module for that mission.